My name is Myrtle Bramble, and I am 74 years old. Most people in St. Peter's know me as the old lady from the Victorian mansion on Cypress Hill, or Widow Bramble with the antiques collection. Some people, especially younger people, probably think I'm an eccentric old lady who walks around the park wearing feathered hats and talking to pigeons. Let them think what they want. When you get to my age, you realize that outsiders' opinions are the last thing you need to worry about. Our house has been here since 1892. My late husband Hubert came from a family that settled in St. Peter's before the town was even named. The Brambles' wealth was accumulated over generations, starting with importing tea and spices, then moving on to real estate and investments. Hubert was the only son in his family, as our Oswald is in ours. Perhaps that is one of the many mistakes we made, not giving him brothers or sisters. I met Hubert in 1968 when I was working as a curator at the City Art Gallery. He came to an Impressionist exhibition and stayed in front of a Pissarro painting for an hour. I thought he had fallen asleep standing up or was in some kind of trance, so I went over to make sure he was all right. He turned to me and said, "You know, young lady, if you look long enough, you can see the clouds moving." And he smiled so that his eyes turned into slits. 3 months later, we were engaged. 2 more months later, we were married. A lot of people thought I married him for his money. That may have been partially true, but not in the way they thought. It wasn't his personal wealth that attracted me, but the way he treated it as a tool for creating beauty, for preserving art and history. Hubert was never a miser. On the contrary, he was generous, sometimes to the point of recklessness. Our business grew out of a shared passion for beauty. We started Bramble and Bramble Gallery, which specialized in rare art and antiques. At first, it was a small space on Main Street, but gradually we expanded to a chain of 3 galleries in different towns around the state. Hubert handled the sourcing and authentication of the art, and I handled the presentation and sale of the art. We complemented each other like yin and yang. Oswald was born 5 years after we were married. From the beginning, he was a difficult child. Not bad, no, just demanding, with a keen sense of ownership and a tendency to manipulate. I remember when he was 4 years old and threw a tantrum at the toy store when I told him we weren't buying a third model train set in a week. He screamed so loudly that people turned around, and I, to my shame, gave in. Hubert was even gentler with his only son and heir. Perhaps that was our biggest mistake. We never taught Oswald to hear no. When Oswald was 20, he introduced us to Prudence Home. She was an attractive girl from a good but not wealthy family, studying law, and had clear ideas about the future. Too clear, it seemed to me. At the second meeting, she was already asking about the Bramble family traditions, inquiring about the business, and, by the way, wondering if we had a home besides the main one. Hubert found her ambitiousness charming. I saw in her a cold calculation. They were married a year later. It was a lavish wedding. Prudence insisted. They honeymooned at our villa on the coast. Then came the demand for seed money for the young family. Hubert didn't hesitate for a moment and wrote a check for 6 figures. I remained silent, though my inner voice cried out that this was a mistake. For the first few years, Oswald and Prudence visited us regularly. Christmas, Thanksgiving, birthdays. They always left with gifts, antique trinkets that Prudence immediately mentally appraised, decorations for their new home, checks for expenses. I noticed how the tone of their visits changed from, "How are you, Dad and Mom?" to, "How are your investments, Dad? Isn't it time to review your portfolio?" When Hubert turned 65, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. It progressed slowly but inexorably. In 10 years, my energetic, witty husband had become a shadow of his former self. For the last 2 years, he hardly spoke, hardly recognized even me. I nursed him myself, refusing the nurses that Oswald and Prudence had urged me to use. You need help, Mom, my son said with a concerned look on his face. It's not like you're getting any younger. We can hire professionals, Prudence echoed. Daddy Hubert would feel more comfortable, but I saw right through them. They wanted an outsider to inform them of Hubert's condition, of his and my movements, conversations, decisions. They were waiting for it all to be theirs. Hubert died in his sleep 3 years ago, in our bedroom, holding my hand. His last coherent words, spoken in a moment of lucidity a few weeks before his death, were, "Watch out for the wolves, Myrtle. They're at the doorstep." At the funeral, Oswald and Prudence stayed close to me, supporting me under the elbows, accepting condolences on my behalf. They organized a wake at our house without even asking me. Strangers went through the rooms, touched Hubert's things, sat in his chair. In the evening, when everyone had gone, Oswald stayed behind. Prudence helped me clear the table, ostentatiously carefully stacking the family silver in cases. "Mother," Oswald said, sitting down across from me with a glass of brandy from Hubert's collection. "We have business to discuss." That was that. Not 24 hours after the funeral, and the business already demanded discussion. "Papa left a somewhat confusing asset situation," he continued, taking a sip. "Some investments need immediate attention. I don't think you need to worry about that. I'll take care of everything." I looked at my son, a 44-year-old man with balding hair and a looming second chin, so much like a young Hubert, but completely different on the inside, and felt something snap between us. "Hubert was a very organized man," I said quietly. "All the papers are in perfect order." "Of course, Mom," Oswald agreed quickly. "But investment management is complicated, even for people at a younger age, with your blood pressure and after so much stress." That's when I realized the game had begun. They saw me as a frail old woman whose days were coming to an end and whose estate was only a matter of time. They were wrong. I may have lost my husband, but not my mind or willpower. After the funeral, the frequency of their visits increased. Each time they brought some paperwork to sign, powers of attorney, authorizations, statements. "It's just a formality, Mom," she said. "It'll make it easier to manage your accounts. It's for your own safety." I signed without looking or pretending not to look. In fact, I read every line and then consulted with Ebenezer Bunkle, Hubert's old friend and our family attorney. Within a year of Hubert's death, the picture became clear. Oswald was systematically trying to take control of all our assets: the main house, the villa on the coast, accounts, stocks, galleries, even Hubert's vintage car collection. Prudence, with her legal background, was the perfect partner in this endeavor. She knew what documents to prepare and how to word them. One evening, as I sat in the library looking through old photo albums, the phone rang. It was Ebenezer. "Myrtle, I don't like what I see," he said without preamble. "They're trying to create a legal construct that will effectively take away your control of your estate, the power of attorney that you signed last week. It gives Oswald the right to dispose of the villa." "I know, Ebenezer," I replied. "I signed everything knowingly. But Myrtle, I have a plan. Come tomorrow to tea, and I'll explain it all." The next day, over a cup of Earl Grey and ginger cookies made from my grandmother's recipe, I outlined my plan to Ebenezer. He listened in silence, occasionally raising his eyebrows or rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Are you sure you want to go this route?" he asked when I was done. "It could lead to a complete breakdown in your relationship with your son." "A relationship that's built on lies and greed is already broken," I replied. "I just want to make sure my assets aren't squandered while I'm still alive." Well, Ebenezer finished his tea and set the cup on the saucer. I'll help you. Thus began our secret asset protection project. We worked quickly and carefully. A complex structure of trusts and companies was set up. Most of the assets, including the villa and the car collection, were rearranged so that I retained the right to use them during my lifetime, but legally they belonged to other organizations. Oswald and Prudence suspected nothing. I continued to sign their papers, which they thought gave them more and more control. In reality, these documents dealt with only a small part of my estate, or were drafted in such a way that they had no real legal effect. Meanwhile, their concern became more and more intrusive. They offered to help me maintain the house by hiring a cleaning service of their own choosing. I agreed, but asked Ebenezer to run a background check on the company. It turned out to be owned by a former classmate of Prudence's, and the rates were tripled. They insisted I sell the galleries because of the stress of running a business at my age. I pretended to consider this possibility while I secretly handed over the running of the galleries to trusted managers with clear instructions not to contact Oswald. Each visit turned into an inspection. Prudence went around the rooms, ostensibly checking for cleanliness, but actually evaluating antiques and works of art. Oswald was examining mail and papers on my desk when he thought I couldn't see. "Mom, are you taking your medicine on time?" he asked with feigned concern. "Maybe we should hire a caregiver." "I think it's time you had your eyesight checked," Prudence said one day when I accidentally poured tea past my cup. "It's so important at our age." At our age. She was 43. I had become old to them, infirm, almost feeble-minded, and I maintained that illusion. Sometimes I forgot where I put my keys or what day of the week it was. I didn't understand how to use the new cell phone they bought me, which I later found out had a location tracking feature. I paused in my conversation as if I was losing my train of thought. All the while, I was watching and waited. Ebenezer had warned me that sooner or later they would try something drastic. They wouldn't be content with slowly gaining control. They wanted everything at once. And I knew he was right. Hubert knew it too. "Watch out for the wolves, Myrtle." He'd always seen their true nature. He just didn't want to admit that his only son could be one. Looking now at our family portrait, taken for Hubert and I's 40th wedding anniversary, a year before his diagnosis, I see smiling faces. Hubert and I, gray-haired but still full of energy. Oswald, solid in his expensive suit, with his hand on his father's shoulder. Prudence, impeccably elegant, with a string of pearls around her neck. A gift from us for her 30th birthday. A happy family. So it might seem to an outsider. But if you looked closely, you could see what I had noticed when the photograph was printed. Oswald's gaze, directed not at the camera, but at the handmade antique clock on the mantelpiece behind us. An evaluating, calculating gaze. Wolves don't change their nature. But old foxes like me know their habits and know how to keep themselves safe. I've decided I won't be a victim. I would be one step ahead, always. On a rainy October evening, 7 months after Hubert's funeral, I invited Ebenezer Bounkel to dinner. He arrived at 7 sharp, punctual as ever, with a bottle of good red wine and a folder of papers under his arm. He hadn't changed much in the 40 years we'd been friends. Still the same lean, trim man, with his gray hair slicked back and an attentive look from under his bushy eyebrows. Only the wrinkles had deepened, and a cane had appeared, the consequence of an unfortunate fall on the ice 3 years ago. "You look better than you did last week, Myrtle," he said when we were seated in the dining room in front of the fireplace. "Don't fool an old woman, Ebenezer." I poured the soup onto plates. "We both know I look exactly like a 70-year-old widow who's being ripped off by her own children." He grinned, but his eyes remained serious. I've been going over the papers you gave me last week, the ones Oswald made you sign. As I suspected, it's a power of attorney with very broad powers, practically gives him the right to handle your finances as he sees fit. I nodded, stirring the soup. Hubert would be disappointed. He had always believed that Oswald was just immature and would eventually realize the value of family more than the value of money. Hubert was an optimist, Ebenezer remarked softly, breaking off a piece of bread. You've always been a realist. Not always. I shook my head. If I had been a realist, I would have seen it 20 years ago when Oswald had first asked me to lend him a substantial sum for temporary difficulties in his first business. Hubert insisted then that we help, no paperwork, no repayment schedule. He's our son, Myrtle. How can we require a receipt from him? And what happened in the end? The business collapsed after 6 months, and the money evaporated. Ebenezer looked at me carefully. What do you want to do, Myrtle? I've known that gleam in your eye since the time you got the city council to drop the idea of tearing down the old library for another shopping center. I put the spoon down and looked right at him. I want to protect what Hubert and I have spent a lifetime building, not to disinherit Oswald, but to stop him from squandering it while I'm still alive. E. I paused. I want to teach him a lesson. What kind of lesson? The consequences. That greed doesn't always lead to success, and that you shouldn't think your mother's out of her mind just because she's over 70. Ebenezer looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. I have some ideas, but it'll take time and some acting on your part. Thus began the plot of Ebenezer and me. Over the next few months, we created a complex legal construct that looked simple on paper, but was nearly impenetrable to those who didn't know all of its details. First, we set up a family trust, the Bramble Family Trust. At first glance, a conventional vehicle for managing family assets. Oswald was even listed as one of the beneficiaries, which no doubt would have pleased him had he known about it. But the devil, as they say, is in the details. Thanks to Ebenezer's skillfully drafted statute, I retained full control of the trust during my lifetime, and upon my death, management passed to the Board of Trustees rather than automatically to Oswald. We then transferred most of our most valuable assets to the trust: the villa on the coast, Hubert's car collection, the most valuable art from our galleries, a significant portion of our investment portfolio. Everything was done legally, with the necessary paperwork and registrations, but without too much fuss. What about the main house? Ebenezer asked as we discussed the details. The one you live in now? Let it stay as it is, I decided. Oswald must think that he has access to at least part of the inheritance. Besides, I don't want him to suspect anything before he does. In parallel with setting up the trust, I signed all the papers that Oswald and Prudence brought in: powers of attorney, consents, forms, anything that gave them the illusion of control. Ebenezer reviewed each document ahead of time and made copies for our records. It's like a game of chess, he remarked one day, looking through another stack of papers. They think they're moving a knight, but they're actually moving a pawn. I just smiled. Hubert had taught me to play chess in our first year of marriage, and I had proved to be a capable student. Oswald had never been interested in the game. It was too slow, too complicated for his impulsive nature. A particularly tricky move was the creation of a second shadow trust that even Ebenezer didn't know about. I contacted an out-of-state lawyer with whom Hubert had done business years before. This additional structure was insurance in case something went wrong with the main trust. In the spring, about a year after Hubert's death, Oswald and Prudence paid me a surprise visit on a Sunday morning. They arrived with a bouquet of flowers, a box of cakes, and, much more importantly, a new stack of papers. "Mom, we're so worried about you." Oswald began as we sat down in the living room. He looked particularly solid in his new suit, which was obviously expensive. You spend too much time alone in this huge house? I'm not alone, I objected calmly. There's Margaret, who comes to cook and clean 3 times a week, and Thomas, who does the garden. But that's not the same as family, Prudence interjected with a concerned expression on her face that I'm sure she was practicing in front of the mirror. We think you'd be better off in a place where you'd be taken care of by professionals. I feigned incomprehension. What are you talking about, dear? A nursing home, Mom, Oswald said, trying to speak softly. Or rather, a residence for the elderly. We found a wonderful place. Sunny Acres. There are all the amenities there. Medical staff, entertainment, socializing. And what happens to the house? I asked, looking out the window at the garden that Hubert and I had planned and planted together 30 years ago. We'll take care of it, Prudence answered quickly. Maybe rent it out to cover your living expenses at the residence. I barely held back a chuckle. Rent it out, as if they already owned the house. I don't want to move, I said, trying to keep my voice sounding weak and unsure. This is my house. It's Hubert's and mine. Mother, be reasonable. Oswald started to get annoyed, but quickly pulled himself together. You can't live here forever. It's too big a place for one person. Besides, the stairs, the garden, all that takes strength, which you have less and less of. I'm not saying it has to happen right now, Prudence added conciliatingly. But we have to prepare. That's why we brought these papers. She pulled a folder out of her purse and placed it on the coffee table. These are just preliminary papers, nothing serious, just to have everything ready when the time comes. I took the folder slowly, pretending to struggle to focus my eyes on the text. In fact, I could see perfectly well that they were documents transferring ownership of the house and authorizing me to manage all my financial affairs. In essence, they were asking me to sign a waiver of autonomy. I should read this, I said, setting the folder aside, and consult with Ebenezer. Oswald's face tensed. Why bother the old man? He's busy enough as it is. Besides, it's a mere formality. Nothing will change until you decide to move. Still, I'd like Ebenezer to look at the papers, I said softly but firmly. He's always helped me with legal matters. Mother. Oswald leaned closer, his voice lower. Prudence and I are your family. We take care of you. Ebenezer is just an old acquaintance of Father's. He's my friend. I looked my son straight in the eye. And I trust his judgment. There was a tense pause. Prudence was the first to break the silence. Of course, Myrtle. If it would make you feel better, have Ebenezer look over the documents. We have nothing to hide. Oswald gave her an annoyed look, but nodded. Good, but don't drag this out too long, okay? Sunny Acres won't keep the place forever. After they left, I immediately called Ebenezer. He arrived an hour later, looked over the paperwork, and shook his head. This is even more brazen than I expected, he said, setting aside the folder. They're actually asking you to give them control of all your assets, including the right to sell the house without your further consent. What are we going to do? I asked, pouring the tea. What we plan to do, he answered calmly. I'll make a few changes to these documents. They will look the same, but with key differences in wording. You will sign the modified version. Oswald and Prudence will think they got what they wanted. What about the Sun Acres? I asked. I'll check that place out, Ebenezer said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. But I doubt they've really booked a place for you. It's probably just a way to apply pressure. He turned out to be right. The Sun Acres existed, but no one had made a reservation there for Myrtle Bramble. What's more, the facility had a dubious reputation. Several lawsuits from families of former residents for improper care. A week later, I signed Ebenezer's amended paperwork and gave it to Oswald. He was so pleased he didn't even notice the difference. Prudence, with her law degree, might have noticed the switch, but Oswald didn't even seem to show her the papers before putting them away in the safe in his office. Ebenezer and I continued our work to protect my assets. By summer, we had completed the bulk of the transfers of assets into the trust. The seaside villa that Hubert had bought early in our marriage, where we spent every August, was now formally owned by the trust. Just like the collection of antique cars that Hubert had collected so enthusiastically. Particularly difficult was the reissuance of shares in the companies we owned. Some of them were jointly owned with Oswald, a gift from Hubert for his son's 30th birthday. Ebenezer had to exercise all his skill to restructure these assets without attracting attention. "Are you sure you want to go that far?" he asked me one day when we were going through another batch of documents. "Oswald is your son after all. Maybe you should leave him some direct control," I wondered. Despite all the disappointment and resentment, a mother's love does not disappear completely. Somewhere deep inside, there was a hope that Oswald could change, that he could realize his mistakes. "All right," I said at last. "We'll leave him a share in the galleries, but on the condition that he can't sell them without the approval of the board of directors." Ebenezer nodded and made a note. "What about the money in the bank accounts?" he asked. "We'll leave available enough to maintain the appearance that everything is the same. The rest we'll put into a trust." That's what we did. In the accounts to which Oswald had access through the power of attorney, there were still sufficient amounts to arouse no suspicion, but the bulk of the capital was securely protected in the trust. By the fall of that year, the protection structure was fully lined up. I felt both relieved and sad at the same time. Relief, because my assets were safe. Sadness, because I had to defend myself against my own son. Meanwhile, Oswald and Prudence, unaware of my actions, became increasingly assertive. Their visits became more frequent, but their character changed. Now they came not to ask or persuade, but to inform me of decisions they had already made. "Mom, we decided that it's time to update the interior," said Oswald during one of the visits. "This furniture is outdated, and the paintings can be replaced with something more modern." "But I love this furniture," I objected. "Every piece here has a story." "History is fine, but you have to move on," he said. "Besides, some of these pieces could be sold for a profit. I've already contacted an auction house." Without my permission, I let the anger show in my voice. Oswald seemed puzzled by my reaction. "Mom, we talked about this. I'm helping you run the house. You signed the papers yourself." "I signed a power of attorney to manage the finances, not authorization to sell my things," I said, straightening up in my chair. "Don't be so dramatic," Prudence interjected. "Oswald just wants you to live in a more modern environment. And speaking of which, we think it's time you stopped driving." "What?" I was genuinely surprised. "It's for your safety," she said in that tone you use with a naughty child. "At your age, your reactions slow down. Your eyesight deteriorates. We can hire a driver or use a cab when you need to go somewhere. Or I can drive you when I'm free," Oswald added, though we both knew he was never free. "I drive fine," I said firmly. "My doctor has confirmed that my health allows me to drive, and I'm not going to give up that independence." Oswald and Prudence exchanged a glance, the same glance that people exchange when they are dealing with a difficult old man. "All right, Mother," Oswald said with feigned patience. "We'll come back to this conversation later." After they left, I got into my little Volvo, not a luxury car, but a reliable one, which I preferred to Hubert's collector models, and drove to Ebenezer's. I told him about the conversation. "They're getting more aggressive," he remarked when I finished. Perhaps they suspect something or are just in a hurry to gain control while you can still resist. What should I do? I asked. Keep playing your part, he said after a pause. Give in to the little things so they don't suspect something wrong in the big things. Let them think they are gradually gaining the upper hand. I followed his advice. Over the next few months, I let Oswald and Prudence make some changes to the house. New curtains, rearranging the furniture in the guest rooms. I agreed to a driver for long trips, though I insisted on continuing to drive around town myself. They took these concessions as a sign that I was becoming more compliant, less able to assert my independence. And just as Ebenezer had predicted, their appetites grew. Looking through the mail one morning, I found an envelope from a real estate agent. Inside was a letter addressed to Oswald, with an estimate of the market value of a villa on the coast and an offer of services to sell it. The letter had accidentally been delivered to my address instead of Oswald's office. I immediately called Ebenezer. "They're going to sell the villa," I said as soon as he picked up the phone. "They can't do that without your permission," he reminded me. "The villa belongs to the trust. But Oswald thinks he has all the rights to it. He could forge my signature or convince someone to act on my behalf. That would be a felony, Myrtle." "Do you think that would stop him?" I asked. "He's sure no one will notice, especially me, an old, absent-minded mother." Ebenezer was silent for a moment, pondering the situation. "Maybe it's time to see how far he's willing to go," he said finally. "What do you suggest?" "Let's let him try to sell the villa. Let's see what he does when he discovers he has no legal right to do so." "It's risky," I said. "What if the sale does go through?" "It won't," Ebenezer said firmly. "I'll contact the registry office and alert them to a possible attempted illegal sale. Any transaction will be scrutinized." I agreed with Ebenezer's plan. Part of me hoped Oswald would come to his senses, realize he was going too far. The other part, the more cynical, more realistic part, knew that wouldn't happen. Oswald was too sure of his impunity, too used to getting what he wanted. Meanwhile, I continued to play the role of an old woman gradually losing her mental clarity. I forgot important dates, confused names, sometimes pretended not to remember recent conversations. Oswald and Prudence took this as confirmation of their rightness. I really needed their help in managing the estate. They didn't realize that behind the outward forgetfulness, there was a sharp mind recording their every word, their every action. They didn't know that I kept a diary, recording all their attempts to manipulate me. They didn't realize that I had a separate phone line they didn't know about and that I communicated regularly with Ebenezer, planning our strategy. They thought I was weak, and that was their biggest mistake. March was surprisingly warm. I was sitting in my garden, enjoying the first real rays of spring sunshine and the fragrance of the blooming hyacinths that Hubert and I had planted almost 10 years ago. I had a cup of tea in my hands and an open book of poems by Auden, one of my husband's favorite poets, in my lap. The last few weeks had been surprisingly quiet. Oswald and Prudence had called less often than usual and hadn't shown up for surprise visits. Part of me enjoyed this respite, but another part of me, the more wary and suspicious part, knew that silence often preceded a storm. Ebenezer was of the same opinion. "They're up to something," he said during our last conversation. "Perhaps they found it difficult to access some assets and are trying to figure out what's wrong. Or they've finally decided to respect my independence," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Ebenezer just shook his head with a slight smile. We both knew it was unlikely. The ringing of the phone interrupted my thoughts. Oswald's name popped up on the screen. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for another request or demand, and answered. "Good morning, Oswald," I said softly, trying to make my voice sound a little tired, as if I had just woken up, even though it was almost 11. Mother! Oswald's voice sounded unusually cheerful and energetic. I'm so glad I caught you. I have great news. Something in his tone made me wary. I knew that special tinge of smugness in his voice when Oswald was particularly pleased with himself. What news, dear? I asked, trying to sound serene. I just came from the lawyer, he said with a note of triumph. We finalized the deal with your villa. Can you imagine? We managed to sell it for more than the market price. This Russian businessman literally fell in love with the view of the bay and did not even try to bargain. I felt my heart clench, not from the fear of losing the villa. I knew it was legally protected, but from the bitterness of realizing how far my son was willing to go. What villa are you talking about, Oswald? I asked, trying to keep my voice low. What do you mean, Mother? There was a slight impatience in his voice. The villa in Beach Haven, of course. The one Dad bought early in your marriage. We discussed it, remember? Keeping a house that big is a waste of money, especially when you're hardly ever there. The lie came off his lips so easily, so naturally. We never discussed selling the villa. Never. Oh, the villa, I said thoughtfully, as if trying to remember. How much did they pay for it? 2,600,000, he said proudly. A fantastic price, considering the state of the real estate market. I've already transferred the money into an investment account. We'll discuss the details when we meet, but I have some great ideas for reinvestment. I almost admired his chutzpah. We'll discuss the details, as if I had anything to do with his decisions. What about the furniture, with Hubert's stuff? I asked, putting a shiver of worry into my voice. Oh, don't worry about that, he said condescendingly. Most of the furniture was included in the price. It's old, and not particularly valuable anyway. The personal belongings I took. By the way, I forgot to tell you, I also found a buyer for Dad's Jaguar, the blue one he loved so much. A collector from Europe offered a very generous sum. I squeezed the handle of the cup so hard I was surprised it didn't crack. The Jaguar was Hubert's favorite car, a vintage model he'd restored over the years, investing not only money but also his soul. He would never approve of selling it. You sold the car too? I asked, not hiding my shock. Not yet, but the deal is almost closed, Oswald replied nonchalantly. The money will be in the account by the end of the week. Don't worry, Mom. I've taken care of everything. There was so much self-confidence in his voice, so much absolute conviction, that for a moment I felt doubtful. Maybe I had signed something that gave him that authority after all. Maybe I really had forgotten some important conversation? No, I knew for a fact that I had never authorized the sale of the villa or the car. It was purely a scam. Oswald, I said, making my voice as calm as possible. Tell me, please, are you sure you have the right to sell this villa? There was a pause, brief but noticeable. What a strange question, Mother. His tone became more cautious. Of course I do. I have a power of attorney to manage your assets. You signed it yourself last fall. Yes, I remember the power of attorney, I said. But are you sure it covers the villa? Have you checked the current property deeds? Again the pause, longer this time. Mom, what are you talking about? There was irritation in his voice, but I could hear the uncertainty behind it. The villa has always been yours. I mean, yours and Dad's, and after he died, yours alone. Not exactly. I let my voice get firmer. The villa hasn't belonged to me for years, and it doesn't belong to you, of course. What? His exclamation was filled with such astonishment that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. What do you mean it doesn't belong to you? Who does it belong to then? The Bramble Family Trust, I answered calmly. A trust that was set up while your father was still alive to protect the family assets. That wasn't entirely true. The trust had been set up after Hubert's death, but it seemed fair to me to use my husband's authority in this situation. What trust? Oswald's voice rose higher with tension. I've never heard of any trust. Perhaps you didn't listen when your father and I talked about it, I said, feeling bitterness rising in my throat. You've always been more interested in the result than the process, Oswald. This is nonsense, he was almost shouting. If there was any trust, I'd know about it. I would have seen the documents. Ebenezer has the papers, I said. Everything is legal, with registration with the proper authorities. You can check in the real estate registry. The villa really belongs to the trust for more than 2 years. Oswald was breathing heavily into the tube. I could almost see him frantically trying to comprehend the information, to calculate the consequences. It's impossible, he said at last, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. I saw the deeds to the villa. They were in Dad's safe. You saw copies of the old documents, I explained. The originals had been reissued and transferred to the trust. If you'd looked closely at the dates on those papers, you'd have noticed that they were out of date. There was a silence that lasted so long that I wondered if the connection had broken down. At last, Oswald spoke, and his voice sounded completely different, tense, almost frightened. If what you say is true, if the villa really belongs to some trust, then the deal, null and void, I finished for him. You had no right to sell property that doesn't belong to you. In fact, it could be considered fraud. Fraud! He almost choked with indignation. I am your son. I was acting in your best interests. How can you accuse me of fraud? I'm not accusing anyone, Oswald, I said calmly. I'm just stating the facts. You sold the property without a legal right to do so. What would you say of a man who would do that to your property? He didn't answer. I could hear his heavy breathing and imagine the color of anger and confusion flooding his face. I have to go, he finally said. I'll call you back. He hung up without a goodbye. I sat in the garden, looking at the hyacinths and thinking about how quickly life was changing. An hour ago, I was just an older woman enjoying a spring day. Now I was a participant in a family drama that could have serious legal consequences. I didn't feel triumphant, even though the plan had worked exactly as Ebenezer and I had envisioned. Instead, a deep sadness filled me. My only son had been willing to deceive me, to sell things dear to my heart, to embezzle money, all without the slightest remorse. The phone rang again. This time it was Ebenezer. Myrtle, he said without preamble. I've just had a call from Oswald. He was agitated. I can imagine, I replied dryly. He'd found out about the trust. Yes, and he wasn't very happy. Demanded to see the documents, yelled something about machinations behind his back. As if what he was trying to do wasn't a scam, I observed. Exactly, Ebenezer agreed. I told him that all the paperwork was in order and suggested we meet in my office to discuss the situation. He agreed, but I wouldn't say he took it enthusiastically. When's the meeting? Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Do you want to attend? I wondered. Part of me wanted to be there, to see Oswald's face when he realized his plan had failed. But another part of me couldn't bear the thought of a direct confrontation with my son. No, I finally decided. Let it be a lawyer-client meeting. If Oswald wants to talk to me afterward, well, I'll be here. As you wish, Ebenezer said. I'll call you right after the meeting. After our conversation, I returned to the house and headed for the library, the room that Hubert considered the heart of our home. Not only books were collected here, but memorabilia, photographs, small souvenirs from travels, a whole life captured in objects. I took an old photo album from the shelf and opened it. Here's Oswald at age 5 on the beach near the villa, building a sand castle. Here he is at 12 on the bicycle Hubert and I gave him for his birthday. Here's his college graduation, Hubert, with his hand on his son's shoulder, both in their dress suits, smiling, proud. What went wrong? When did love of family turn into lust for possession? When did caring become control? Perhaps Hubert and I had given Oswald too much and demanded too little in return. Perhaps we created a world where his desires were always satisfied, and he didn't learn to appreciate what he had or respect other people's boundaries. Or maybe it was just his nature to take without thinking of the consequences for others. The phone rang again, interrupting my musings. This time it was Prudence. Myrtle? Her voice was cold and tense. I just talked to Oswald. He's in a terrible state. Hello, Prudence, I answered calmly. Yes, we spoke to him this morning. What is this trust you told him about? She got straight to the point, as usual. And why are we only finding out about it now that the deal is done? The trust was set up to protect family assets, I said. And you didn't know about it because you didn't ask. You just assumed you had the right to handle my assets. Your estate? I could hear the irritation in her voice. It's family property, Myrtle. Oswald is your only son and heir. He has a right to know about such things. Of course he does, I agreed. And if he had asked about the legal status of the villa before he tried to sell it, he would have known. But he didn't, did he? He just took it and sold what he thought belonged to me without even discussing it with me. We've discussed it with you many times. Prudence objected. The villa stands empty most of the year, requiring maintenance. It's an unwise use of resources. When did we discuss it? I asked bluntly. Give me a date, Prudence. When I said I agreed to sell the villa? She fell silent. We both knew that such a conversation had never taken place. It doesn't matter, she said at last. What matters is that we have a problem now. The buyer can sue for breach of contract. Not me, I pointed out. I didn't sign any contracts, and not on the trust. The trustees of the trust didn't agree to the sale either. The only one who might run into legal trouble is Oswald, who sold something that didn't belong to him. Are you really going to let this happen? Prudence sounded disbelief. You're going to let your son face a lawsuit? Do you really think I should watch silently as my son sells off my property without my consent? I answered with a question to a question. That's different, Prudence said, but her voice was no longer as confident as before. In what way? I asked. Is it that one thing is to your advantage and the other is not? We do it for your own good, she exclaimed. You can't manage all this on your own anymore. You forget things. You get confused. How convenient, I remarked dryly. When I disagree with you, it's because I'm confused. When I remember something you'd rather I forget, it's just a coincidence. Prudence took a deep breath, clearly trying to keep control of herself. Look, Myrtle, she said more gently. Let's not make things worse. Oswald's meeting with Ebenezer tomorrow, and they'll deal with this trust. I'm sure we'll find a solution that will suit everyone. I hope so too, I said, though I doubted that such a solution existed. Good day, Prudence. I hung up, feeling strangely relieved. For the first time in a long time, I was being honest with them. No feigned forgetfulness or weakness, no playing along with their plans. Just the truth, direct and unvarnished. I spent the rest of the day in the quiet of the house, going about my daily business, but my thoughts kept returning to the coming meeting between Oswald and Ebenezer. What would my son say when he saw the documents proving that the villa really belonged to the trust? How will he explain his actions? Would he admit his mistake, or would he insist that he was right? By late afternoon, I realized I didn't want to wait for Ebenezer's call after the meeting. I wanted to be there, to see Oswald's face, to hear his explanation firsthand. This was my son, after all, no matter how disappointing he was. And it was my life, my possessions that he was trying to control. I called Ebenezer and told him I'd changed my mind. I'll come to the meeting, I said. Oswald owes me as well as you an explanation for his actions. Are you sure? Ebenezer asked. It could be an unpleasant conversation. I'm sure, I answered firmly. It was time for Oswald to realize that I could still stand up for myself. After the conversation with Ebenezer, I felt strangely calm. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in my relationship with my son. Perhaps not the most pleasant, but at least a more honest one. I went to the window and looked out over the garden, sinking into twilight. The hyacinths were still visible, bright patches of color amidst the encroaching darkness. Hubert had always said those flowers symbolized rebirth. Perhaps tomorrow would be the beginning of something new, not just for me, but for Oswald too. Perhaps, faced with the consequences of his actions, he will finally see how far he has come. Or maybe it would just be the end, a recognition that some relationships couldn't be saved, that some rifts were too deep to heal. Either way, I was ready to face tomorrow with open eyes and a hard heart. Ebenezer Bouncle's office was located in an old red brick building in downtown St. Peters. I had always loved this place with its wood paneling, antique furniture, and an air of reliability that cannot be created artificially. It only comes with time. I arrived 20 minutes before my appointment. Ebenezer's secretary, Doris, a woman of my age with whom we had become good acquaintances over the years, greeted me with a sympathetic smile. "He's waiting for you, Mrs. Bramble," she said, ushering me into Ebenezer's office. My old friend rose from his desk when he saw me. His face looked more serious than usual. "Oswald hasn't arrived yet," he said, helping me into a chair. But he confirmed that he would be. Really, he sounded tense. "No wonder," I replied. "Yesterday he thought he'd made a good deal on the villa. Today he found he might face a lawsuit for fraud." Ebenezer nodded and sat down across from me. The buyer, by the way, had already called me this morning. That Russian businessman? I remembered what Oswald had said. Yes, Mr. Volkov, and he's not happy to say the least. His lawyer found a discrepancy in the final check before the money was transferred. What's he going to do about it? For now, he's demanding an explanation and compensation for his time and legal fees. But if the situation isn't resolved satisfactorily, he's ready to file a fraud lawsuit. I sighed. The situation was exactly as we had envisioned, but the reality was still harder than I had expected. "What about the car?" I asked. Oswald said he'd found a buyer for Hubert's Jaguar, too. "As far as I know, that deal hasn't been finalized yet," Ebenezer said, "and given the circumstances, it's unlikely to be finalized. The collector is likely to find out about the problems with the villa and want to double-check the car's papers." We heard voices in the reception area. One of them, loud and clearly irritated, belonged to Oswald. A moment later, the door swung open and my son burst into the office, with Doris, trying unsuccessfully to restrain him, following at his heels. "Mom?" He stopped when he saw me. "What are you doing here?" "Your mother has every right to be at this meeting," Ebenezer said calmly. "After all, it is about her property." "Her property?" Oswald interjected sarcastically. "I thought it belonged to some mysterious trust that no one knew existed until yesterday." "Sit down, Oswald," I said, trying to keep my voice firm but not hostile. "We have much to discuss." To my surprise, he obeyed, though his face remained tense. I noticed that he looked tired with dark circles under his eyes and a droopy face. It had obviously been a restless night for him. "So," Ebenezer began, pulling out a file folder, "let's get this straight. The villa in Beach Haven, as well as a significant portion of the other assets, including the car collection, has been owned by the Bramble Family Trust since March of the year before last. Here are the documents to prove it. He handed Oswald several sheets of paper. My son glanced at them, and I watched his face change from disbelief to anger to something like fear. "It's a forgery," he finally said, throwing the papers on the table. "These papers are fabricated." "Not at all," Ebenezer objected calmly. "All the documents are legally flawless, registered with the appropriate authorities, and have all the necessary signatures and seals. You can verify their authenticity in any state registry." "And all this was done behind my back." Oswald raised his voice, looking at me accusingly. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide it? And why didn't you ask me before you sold the villa?" I answered with a question for a question. "Why did you think you had the right to dispose of the property without my knowledge? I have a power of attorney." He almost shouted it. "You signed it yourself." "The power of attorney authorizes you to act on my behalf with my consent," I said. "Not in my place or against my will. Besides, it doesn't cover property that doesn't belong to me." Oswald shook his head as if he couldn't or wouldn't understand. "It's all nonsense," he said at last. "How can the villa suddenly no longer belong to you? Who set up this trust? Who manages it?" "The trust was created by my order," I answered. "I am one of its founders, and I have the right to use the property of the trust during my lifetime. But I'm not the sole trustee, and I can't have sole control over the trust's assets." "And you didn't think it necessary to inform me?" There was resentment in Oswald's voice. "I am your son. I am your only child. You had no interest in the legal intricacies of estate administration," I said. "You were only interested in access to it." "That's not fair, Mom." He tried to return to a softer tone. "I've always had your best interests at heart. I've always tried to help you with your finances, especially after your father died." I looked at my son for a long moment. Did he himself believe what he was saying? Did he really think he was looking out for my best interests when he tried to control my money, limit my independence, sell off my assets? "We can discuss motives later," Ebenezer interjected. "Right now, we have a more pressing problem: Mr. Volkov and his threat of legal action." Oswald tensed instantly. "What exactly does he want?" "For the moment, an explanation and reimbursement of expenses," Ebenezer replied. "But if he thinks he was deliberately misled about the ownership of the villa, he could sue for fraud. That would not only be a civil case, but also a criminal one." Oswald's face turned pale. "But I didn't know," he said quietly. "I really thought that the villa belonged to my mother, and that I had the right to sell it by power of attorney." "Ignorance of the law doesn't absolve you of responsibility," Ebenezer observed. "You should have checked the current status of the property before closing the deal. It's standard procedure when selling real estate." "And now what?" Oswald asked, and for the first time in a long time, I heard uncertainty in his voice. "What do I do?" "We have several options," said Ebenezer. "First, you can contact Mr. Volkov and explain the situation, offering compensation for his expenses and inconvenience. Second, if the trust agrees, you can try to implement the deal legally, with the right documents and permits. But this will require the consent of all the trustees of the trust." "And who are the trustees?" Oswald asked, looking at me. "Me, Ebenezer, and another lawyer from Boston," I answered. "Then you can just give your consent, and the problem will be solved," exclaimed Oswald with sudden relief. "Not so fast," said Ebenezer. "Even if Myrtle agrees, and I'm not sure she should, there are still two stewards who must be persuaded, and they have to act in the interest of all the beneficiaries of the trust, not just one." "All the beneficiaries?" Oswald interrogated. "Who is the beneficiary besides Mom?" "You are," I said calmly. And the Bramble Foundation, the charitable foundation that your father and I set up many years ago. Oswald looked stunned. I'm the beneficiary? But then, I'm entitled to a share in the trust's assets? Under certain conditions, yes, Ebenezer confirmed. But not now, and not in the way you have tried to proceed. The trust is set up in such a way that the distribution of assets takes place according to clearly defined rules and time frames. Oswald leaned back in his chair, trying to comprehend the information. I could see the gears turning in his head as he tried to find a way out of the situation, to calculate what would be most beneficial to him. Listen, Mom, he finally said, leaning forward. I didn't know about this trust. I really didn't. I thought I was acting in your best interests. The villa stands empty most of the year, needs maintenance. Selling it seemed like the logical solution. But you didn't ask me, I reminded myself. You didn't discuss it with me. You just sold it and then put me on the spot. I've tried to discuss financial matters with you many times, he said with a tinge of irritation. But you always avoided those conversations, saying you trusted me. I never said I trusted you to handle my assets without my knowledge, I countered. And we both know that you never mentioned plans to sell the villa. Oswald opened his mouth to object, but then closed it, obviously unable to find a convincing argument. He knew I was right. He had never told me about his plans to sell the villa because he knew I would object. Back to the current problem, Ebenezer said, breaking the tense silence. Mr. Volkov is waiting for an answer. What are you going to do, Oswald? My son rubbed his temples, looking much older than his years. I will contact him and explain the situation, he finally said. I'll offer to reimburse him for his expenses. Hopefully that will be enough to avoid a lawsuit. A reasonable solution, Ebenezer nodded. I can attend the conversation if you want the legal side to be properly represented. Yes, that would be helpful, Oswald agreed, clearly struggling with his pride. The meeting ended shortly thereafter. Ebenezer promised to contact Mr. Volkov's lawyer and arrange negotiations. Oswald left, casting one last look at me, a mixture of resentment, anger, and something I couldn't quite pinpoint. Respect, perhaps? Or just surprise at the realization that his 74-year-old mother wasn't as helpless as he'd thought. I stayed with Ebenezer to discuss the details of the upcoming negotiations. Are you really ready to compensate Mr. Volkov for his expenses? He asked when we were alone. Technically, you don't have to do that. I know, I replied, but I don't want that man to suffer because of my son's actions. I don't want Oswald to face criminal prosecution, no matter how irresponsible he is. Ebenezer nodded with understanding. You're still his mother. I always will be, I said with a bitter smile, no matter how much he disappointed me. That same day, I received a call from Prudence. Her voice sounded restrained, but I could hear the tension behind the restraint. Oswald told me about your meeting, she said without preamble, about the trust and the trouble of selling the villa. I'm glad he was frank with you, I replied neutrally. Why didn't you tell us about the trust before? There was reproach in her voice. We could have avoided this whole situation. Why didn't you ask? I answered question for question. Why did Oswald think he could sell the villa without discussing it with me? He thought he was acting in your best interests, Prudence said, but her voice was no longer as confident as before. Selling my property without my knowledge and planning to use the money as he saw fit? I let the skepticism slip into my voice. That's a strange definition of my interests, Prudence. She sighed. Look, Myrtle, what's done is done. What's more important now is to decide how to get out of this situation with as little damage as possible. Oswald says you're willing to help defray the expenses of this Russian? Yes, I am ready, I confirmed. but only the costs associated with the failed deal, nothing more. This man could demand a lot more, she said with concern in her voice. He's already hired a lawyer and is threatening to sue for fraud. I understand his feelings, I said, but Ebenezer is confident that we can resolve the situation without a lawsuit. I hope he's right, Prudence said, and for the first time in a long time, I heard something like respect in her voice. Oswald, he's not at his best. He really didn't know about the trust, Myrtle. It was a shock to him. I believe it, I said more gently, and I don't want him to suffer for it, but I also can't let you dispose of my property without my consent. I hope you both understand that. We do, Prudence said after a pause. We do now. After Prudence had spoken to me, I sat in the garden for a long time, watching the sun go down. The spring air was filled with the scent of flowers and the freshness of newly watered earth. I thought about Hubert. What would he say about the situation? Would he be as disappointed in our son as I was? Or would he have found a way to explain his actions, to justify them? Hubert always saw the best in people, especially Oswald. He believed our son would eventually grow out of his selfishness, his greed. He just hasn't found his way yet, Myrtle, he used to say. Give him time. But time passed, and Oswald did not change. On the contrary, as the years went by, his character traits that troubled us only grew stronger. The desire for control, the desire for material possessions, the disrespect for other people's boundaries, all of these only became more pronounced. A phone call interrupted my musings. It was Ebenezer. I have news, he said without preamble. I've contacted Mr. Volkoff's lawyer. They are ready to negotiate, but their demands are substantial. How significant? I asked, feeling my shoulders tense. They want not only reimbursement of expenses, which would be reasonable, but also compensation for lost profits. Mr. Volkov claims that this deal caused him to turn down other investment opportunities. And how much is that in dollars? About 200,000, in addition to the actual legal fees and the home inspection. I whistled. That's ambitious of him. I think so too, Ebenezer agreed, and I told his lawyer that that amount was unacceptable, but they insist, threatening a lawsuit. What do you suggest? I think we should meet them in person. Mr. Volkoff may be easier to negotiate with than his lawyer. Besides, Oswald should be present after all. He's the one who misled the buyer, albeit unintentionally. I agree, I said after a moment's thought. When do you propose to organize this meeting? The sooner the better. How about tomorrow? We agreed on the details of the meeting, and I hung up the phone, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. On the one hand, I was satisfied that my prudence with the trust had been justified. Without this protection, Oswald could have sold not only the villa, but also other valuable assets. On the other hand, I felt bitter at the confirmation of how self-serving my son's intentions were. I never wanted our relationship to come to this. The mistrust, the legal maneuverings, the ulterior motives. I dreamed of a son who valued family more than money, who respected me not only as a mother, but as a human being with his own rights and desires. But the reality was different, and now I had not only to resolve the current crisis, but also to decide what our relationship with Oswald would be like in the future, if at all. That evening, Oswald showed up unexpectedly on my doorstep. He looked tired, with red eyes and wrinkled clothes, not at all like the confident man I was used to seeing. "May I come in?" he asked quietly, and I stepped back, letting him into the house. We walked into the living room and sat across from each other, like strangers, not mother and son, with a shared history of 45 years. "Did Ebenezer call?" he asked. "About that Russian's demands?" "Yes," I confirmed. 200,000 for lost profits, plus costs. That's a pretty aggressive stance. Oswald nodded, looking down at the floor. I talked to him personally, he said reluctantly. With Mr. Volkov, he's not thrilled, to put it mildly. He thinks he's been deliberately deceived. And what did you tell him? The truth. That I really thought I had the right to sell the villa, that I didn't know about the trust. He looked up at me. I apologized to him, Mother, said I was willing to compensate him for his expenses. I was surprised. Oswald rarely admitted his mistakes and even more rarely apologized for them. And how did he react? He said he'd think about it, but his lawyer? Oswald shook his head. His lawyer insists on compensation, says that otherwise they'll sue not only for breach of contract, but also for fraud. Ebenezer is organizing a meeting for tomorrow, I said. All sides face to face. Maybe we can find a compromise. I hope so, Oswald muttered. He looked unusually depressed, almost vulnerable. Mother, I didn't mean for things to turn out this way. I really didn't. I looked at my son, at his slumped shoulders, at the wrinkles around his eyes that I hadn't noticed before, at the gray in his hair, and felt a rush of complicated emotions, anger, frustration, but also a motherly love that never completely disappears, no matter how much your child hurts you. I know, Oswald, I said more gently. You didn't want to create legal problems, but you must understand, it's not just about the trust or the villa. It's about you trying to dispose of my property without my consent. It was, it was wrong. He nodded without looking up. I understand. I understand now. We sat in silence for a while, each absorbed in his own thoughts. At last, Oswald spoke again. What will happen to us now, Mother, with our relationship? It was a difficult question to which I had no simple answer. I don't know, Oswald, I answered honestly. A lot will depend on what lessons you learn from this situation, and whether you're ready to change. He nodded, as if he had expected that answer. I'll be at the meeting tomorrow, he said, standing up. I'll try to make things right. After he left, I couldn't sleep for a long time. The events of the last few days replayed over and over in my head. I thought of Hubert, of what he would say about our son now. Watch out for wolves, Myrtle. But what if the wolf is your own child? How do you protect yourself without rejecting him completely? I didn't know the answer, but I did know that I could not continue to live in fear that Oswald would dispose of my possessions as he saw fit. The trust was a necessary protection, but it was only the beginning. I needed to reevaluate our entire relationship, set clear boundaries, maybe even distance myself for a while. It was bittersweet to realize that the relationship with my only son had come to this state. But it was even more bitter to continue playing hide and seek, pretending everything was okay when it was obvious it wasn't. Tomorrow is a new day, a new challenge. I will meet it with open eyes and a firm heart, ready to defend what is mine, not just material possessions, but my right to respect and independence. The meeting with Mr. Volkov and his attorney was tense, but generally productive. Ebenezer negotiated brilliantly, emphasizing that there was no intentional deception, only a legal misunderstanding caused by Oswald's ignorance of the existence of the trust. Mr. Volkov, a large man with a hard look and an unexpectedly soft voice, listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions. In the end, we agreed on a compensation of $50,000 plus all documented expenses, much less than originally demanded, but still a substantial sum. Oswald was quiet and reserved throughout the meeting, only rising at the end to personally apologize to Mr. Volkov and shake his hand. The gesture seemed to impress the Russian. His face softened and he nodded with some understanding. Business is business, he said with a noticeable accent. Mistakes happen. It's important to correct them, When we left the building where the meeting was being held, Oswald turned to me. "Thank you for agreeing to reimburse some of the money," he said quietly. "I'll pay you back the money as soon as I can." "Don't worry about it now," I replied, even though I knew very well that it was unlikely that I would ever see the money again. The important thing was that the situation had been resolved without a lawsuit. Ebenezer nodded. "Now we need to prepare and sign the indemnity and waiver agreement. I'll do it today." We went our separate ways, Ebenezer to his office, Oswald to his business, and I went home, feeling strangely empty. The crisis had been overcome. But what next? What would our relationship with our son be like after all that had happened? Before I could even begin to think about it, Oswald and Prudence showed up at my house that evening. They hadn't called beforehand, just knocked on the door around 7 in the evening, when I had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room with a book. Prudence looked as impeccable as ever, in a strict suit, with perfect hair and makeup. Oswald, on the other hand, seemed exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a wrinkled shirt collar. I invited them in, inwardly preparing myself for a difficult conversation. "Tea?" I offered as we settled into the living room. "No, thank you," Prudence answered quickly. "We're here to talk about the situation." Of course, I sat down in the chair across from them, straightening the folds in my dress. "About what exactly?" Prudence cast a quick glance at Oswald, as if expecting him to start a conversation, but my son sat silent, staring at the floor. With slight irritation, she took the initiative. "Myrtle, we realize that there has been a serious misunderstanding," she began in her lawyerly tone. "Oswald was unaware of the existence of the trust and acted on the information he had." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Prudence," I argued calmly. "It was an attempt to sell the property without the consent or even knowledge of the owner. Call things by their proper names." "But Oswald thought he had the right to—" "No, he didn't," I interrupted. "The power of attorney I signed did not give him the right to sell the property without my consent. He knew that, and even if the villa was still in my name, he would still need my explicit consent to sell it." Prudence pressed her lips together, clearly unhappy that her legal argument had been so easily refuted. "Nevertheless," she continued, less confidently, "we are here to find a solution that will satisfy everyone." "A solution has already been found," I said. "We have agreed on compensation with Mr. Volkov. Ebenezer is preparing the paperwork. The matter is closed." "Not quite," Oswald finally intervened, looking up. "Mom, we came to talk about the trust, about why you kept its existence from us, and about what will happen to the family property now." "I didn't hide anything, Oswald," I replied. "I just didn't inform you of every legal or financial decision I made, just as you don't inform me of yours." "But this is about the family inheritance," he exclaimed. "The property that should pass to me." There it was, at last, a direct acknowledgement of what bothered him most, not my well-being, not the safety of my property, but his future inheritance. "Shall pass?" I asked, emphasizing the words. "Who says it should go to you, Oswald? It is my property, and I have the right to dispose of it as I see fit." "But I am your son," he almost shouted. "Your only child. To whom else will you leave all this?" "Perhaps to charitable organizations," I said calmly, "or to friends who were genuinely interested in me, not in my wallet. Or maybe I'd spend it all on traveling, on art, on things that really brought me joy." Oswald's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You can't be serious. It's, it's not fair. Unfair?" I felt the anger rising in me, long held back for the sake of maintaining the semblance of normal relations. "Do you want to talk about dishonesty, Oswald? How about you trying to limit my independence by convincing me that I was getting too old to manage my own affairs? Or how about trying to sell the villa where your father and I spent so many happy years? Or maybe you want to discuss how you plan to move me to Sunny Acres, a place with a terrible reputation, known for mistreating its guests. Oswald looked stunned. Prudence tried to intervene. Myrtle, you're exaggerating. We've always wanted only the best for you. Don't lie to me, Prudence. I turned to her. Don't insult my intelligence. You wanted control of my assets. You wanted control of my money. You wanted me to sit quietly in the corner and stay out of your way. That's not true, exclaimed Oswald. Mother, how can you think that? I have always taken care of you. When, Oswald? I asked bitterly. When was the last time you asked me how I was feeling, not out of politeness, but because you were really interested? When was the last time you offered to spend time with me, not to discuss financial matters, but just because I'm your mother and you want to be with me? He opened his mouth but couldn't find anything to say. Prudence hurried to fill the awkward pause. Myrtle, we're all emotional right now. Let's get back to the trust issue. We believe we have a right to know how much of the family estate is included in it and what the terms of it are. You have no right to that information, I objected. The trust was established legally, following all legal procedures. If you have specific questions, you can contact Ebenezer, and he will decide what information can be provided. This is absurd. Oswald jumped to his feet. We're talking about my inheritance, about my future. No, Oswald. I also stood up, feeling that despite the difference in height, now I am morally superior to him. We are talking about my property, what I've earned with your father through decades of labor, and you have no rights to it, legal or moral, as long as I'm alive. Prudence also rose, obviously trying to reduce the tension. Myrtle, please, let's not make this worse. We came here to find a solution, not to quarrel. What solution do you propose? I asked. We think it would be fair if you included Oswald as a trustee, she said. That way, he would be able to participate in decisions about the family estate. I almost laughed at the absurdity of the suggestion. Include Oswald as trustee after he tried to sell the villa illegally? That would be like putting a fox in charge of the henhouse. Mother, Oswald's voice was resentful. How can you say that? I'm your son. Yes, you are my son, I agreed. And I love you, Oswald, no matter what. But I don't trust you with the management of my property, and after recent events, you must understand why. He blushed with anger or shame, or perhaps both at once. It's because of him, he muttered. That Ebenezer, he's always turned you against me. Don't be silly, I said sharply. Ebenezer never spoke ill of you. On the contrary, he was the one who often advised me to give you a better chance, to believe that you could change. But he also helped me protect my rights and my property, for which I am grateful. Prudence, seeing that the conversation was becoming more and more tense, tried to change tactics. Myrtle, we understand your fears, but think of the future. Oswald is your only heir. Wouldn't it be better to bring him into the estate now, under your guidance, so that he learns responsibility? Wouldn't it be better for him to demonstrate that responsibility first? I parried. Wouldn't it be better for him to prove himself trustworthy before I trust him with something so important? And how do you expect me to prove it? Oswald asked, and for the first time his voice sounded like genuine curiosity rather than anger or resentment. Start by respecting my decisions, I said. Stop treating me like a feeble old woman who can't control her own life. Ask me what I want instead of assuming you know them better than I do. And maybe spend time with me, not because you need something, but because I am your mother, and our companionship should have value in itself. Oswald looked at me with a long stare, as if seeing me for the first time. Maybe he did. Maybe it was the first time he saw not just a mom, not a source of money or care, but a person with her own feelings, desires, and rights. Yeah, I don't know if I can change that much, he finally said quietly. I'm not sure I know how to be different. Then we have a problem, I replied, feeling not so much angry as tired and sad. Because I'm not going to let you manipulate me or dispose of my property without my consent anymore. Prudence, seeing that the conversation had reached an impasse, decided to change her approach. All right, Myrtle, she said in a more businesslike tone. Let's put the matter of the trust aside for the moment. Right now, we have a more pressing problem: compensation for Mr. Volkov. You said you'd cover part of it, but Oswald will still have to pay a substantial share. We, uh, we don't have that kind of spare cash right now. I looked at my sister-in-law carefully. What are you suggesting? We were thinking. She cast a quick glance at Oswald, who remained silent, letting his wife do the talking. Maybe you could give us a loan, from the funds of the trust or from your personal savings. We'll pay it back, of course, with interest as soon as we can. Once again, it was about money. It always came down to that: material possessions, financial gain. No, I said firmly. I won't give you a loan. But, Mother, Oswald began. No, Oswald, I shook my head. You have created this problem by your own actions. You have to solve it yourself. It's called responsibility, the same responsibility Prudence was just talking about. But where would I get that kind of money? There was desperation in his voice. We have mortgages, loans. Sell some of your possessions, I suggested. You have the yacht you bought last year. You've got your watch collection. You've got expensive cars. Do what you so easily suggested I do. Part with the things that have value to you. Oswald turned pale. The idea of selling his own things had obviously never occurred to him. He always thought it was easier to use my resources than his own. It's not fair, he said quietly. You are punishing me. No, Oswald, I sighed. I'm not punishing you. I'm just not saving you from the consequences of your own actions. It's called a life lesson, and it's long overdue. Prudence looked furious. Myrtle, you can't be serious. We're your family. Families help each other in times of need. Yes, they do, I agreed, but not when some family members try to deceive others. Not when instead of respect and love, there's only greed and manipulation. That's not fair, Prudence exclaimed. You paint us as some kind of villains, but we've always wanted the best for you. Did we? I looked her straight in the eye. Then tell me, Prudence, what do you know about my interests, about my dreams, about what makes me happy? She opened her mouth, then closed it, obviously unable to find an answer. Exactly, I said. You were never interested in me as a person. I was just a repository of assets you planned to get. And I put up with it for a long time because you're my family, and I hoped that one day you'd change your attitude. But now I realize that won't happen until I change my behavior, until I stop letting you use me. There was a heavy silence in the room. Oswald stared at the floor. Prudence clenched her fists, obviously holding back her anger. I felt strangely calm, as if a stone had fallen from my soul after I'd finally said everything I'd been holding in for years. So, what about the compensation? Prudence finally asked, returning to the subject at hand. You're really not going to help us? I already am, I reminded her. I'd agreed to cover half of it, even though I wasn't legally responsible for Oswald's actions. The rest is your problem. What are we supposed to do? Oswald's voice sounded almost childishly desperate. What adults do when they face problems, I replied. Solve them. Take responsibility for their actions. Learn from their mistakes. You leave us no choice, Prudence said, rising. We'll have to sell some of our things to cover these expenses. Yes, I agreed. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. They left shortly afterward, Oswald silent and depressed, Prudence taut as a string of barely contained rage. I walked them to the door and closed it behind them, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Back in the living room, I walked over to the fireplace where framed photographs stood, Hubert and I on our wedding day, Oswald in his graduation robe, all of us together at Hubert's 70th birthday party. Happy smiles, hand in hand, the perfect picture of a family idol. Only it was an illusion. Behind the smiles was calculation and greed. Behind the hugs was a desire for control. I didn't notice it in time, didn't want to notice it, because it was too painful to admit that my only son saw me not as a human being, but as a source of future wealth. A phone call interrupted my musings. It was Ebenezer. "How was the meeting?" he asked without preamble. "Not very well," I replied, sinking into the chair. They wanted me to include Oswald among the trustees and to give them a loan to pay the compensation. I refused. "You were right to refuse," Ebenezer said with approval. "Oswald is not yet ready for such responsibility. Perhaps he never will be." "I know," I sighed, "and it breaks my heart, Ebenezer. I've always hoped that one day he would change, that he would be better." "People rarely change, Myrtle," he said softly, "especially when they're in their 40s. But you did what you had to do to protect yourself and your property. That's not selfishness, that's self-preservation." "Yes," I agreed, "but it's still bittersweet to realize that our relationship has come to this point, that I have to defend myself against my own son." "I understand," Ebenezer said quietly. "But remember that you are not alone, Myrtle. You have friends who appreciate you for who you are, not what you have." After talking to Ebenezer, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the garden outside the window. The sun was already setting, coloring the flowers and trees in warm shades of gold and copper. This garden, this house, it was all part of my life, my history, and I would not let anyone, not even my own son, take it away from me or devalue it. I did what I had to do. I refused to save Oswald and Prudence from the consequences of their actions. I refused to give them control over what I hold dear. It was a painful but necessary step. Now they had to decide how to react to this new reality. Would they change when they realized they could no longer manipulate me? Would they find the strength to face the truth and perhaps become better people? Or would they drift further away, resentful that I was no longer playing by their rules? I didn't know the answer to those questions, but I did know that I would no longer live in fear and pretense. I would live honestly and openly, protecting what was mine and demanding the respect I deserved. It was a difficult day, but it was also a day of liberation. The day I finally told the truth, not just to them, but to myself. And no matter how our relationship turned out in the future, I didn't regret that decision. 2 weeks had passed since my difficult conversation with Oswald and Prudence. 2 weeks of silence, no calls, no visits. Only a short message from Ebenezer saying that the agreement with Mr. Volkoff had been signed and the case was closed. Oswald had paid his share of the compensation by selling the yacht, a decision I'm sure had not been easy for him. I used this time to reflect. Every morning I woke up at first light and went out into the garden to walk among the flowers and trees that Hubert and I had planted many years before. Every evening I sat in his chair by the fireplace, flipping through old albums, rereading his letters, remembering our life. The house was full of memories, both happy and bitter. It was here that Hubert first held my hand and told me he loved me. Here Oswald was born, and we spent sleepless nights rocking him. Here we celebrated victories and experienced losses. It's where I nursed Hubert in his final days. watching the disease slowly take him from me. It was also here that I realized how far my relationship with my son had gone, from love and care to manipulation and control. On the 17th day of silence, I made a decision. I called Ebenezer and asked him to come over. "I want to change the will," I said, as he settled into the chair across from mine, "and make changes to the structure of the trust." Ebenezer looked at me carefully over his glasses. "It's a big decision, Myrtle. Are you sure?" "Absolutely," I nodded. "I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks. I can't go on as before." He took out a notebook and a pen. "What exactly do you want to change?" I took a deep breath. Despite the firmness of my decision, it wasn't easy to say it out loud. "I want to formally exclude Oswald from being the primary beneficiary of the trust. He will receive a fixed sum enough to ensure a comfortable life, but nothing more. The rest of the estate will be given to the Bramble Foundation for charitable purposes, except for some personal effects and art that I want to leave to friends." Ebenezer wrote down my words slowly, showing neither surprise nor disapproval. "And the house?" he asked when I stopped talking. "What do you want to do with the house?" I looked around the living room, the high ceilings, the wood paneling, the pictures on the mantelpiece. "I want to sell it," I said quietly. "There are too many memories here, Ebenezer. Good ones and bad ones. I feel like I'm stuck in the past as long as I live here." "And where will you move to?" "I've got my eye on a little house on Magnolia Street," I said. "It's much smaller than this one, but it has a lovely garden and a view of the park. And it's brand new to me, no ghosts of the past, no painful memories." Ebenezer nodded understandingly. "It's a good decision, Myrtle. A new beginning at your age takes courage." "I'm 74, not 94, I grinned. "I have plenty of life ahead of me, and I want to live it on my own terms." We spent the next few hours discussing the details of the changes to the will and trust. Ebenezer carefully recorded my wishes, sometimes suggesting legal language that would better protect my interests. "There's one more thing," I said when we were done with the main points. "I want the Bramble Foundation to establish a Hubert Memorial Scholarship for students of art history. He always believed in the power of education and the arts. It would be a fitting way to keep his memory alive." "That's a wonderful idea," Ebenezer smiled. "Hubert would be touched." When he left, promising to have the paperwork ready by the end of the week, I felt strangely relieved. The decision had been made, the path had been chosen. Now it was necessary to inform Oswald and Prudence. I decided not to postpone the unpleasant conversation. That evening, I called my son and asked him and Prudence to come tomorrow. "Is something wrong, Mother?" I could hear the wariness in his voice. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly all right, Oswald," I answered calmly. "It's just that we need to talk about some important decisions I've made." He didn't ask further, and we arranged to meet the next day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. During the night, I hardly slept at all, thinking about the upcoming conversation. How would Oswald react to my decision? Would he be angry? Will he try to change my mind? Or would he understand and accept? That last thought seemed the least likely, given his character, but I still held out a tiny hope that my son was capable of maturity and understanding. In the morning, I rose early and spent a few hours getting my affairs in order. I gathered all the important documents I might need when selling the house and moving. I went through my art collection, deciding what to take with me to my new home and what to donate to a gallery or museum. Made a list of things that had special sentimental value to me. At noon, I began to prepare for the arrival of Oswald and Prudence. I put on my favorite lavender-colored suit, the one I had worn at Hubert's last birthday party. I carefully styled my hair. I applied light makeup. I wanted to look strong and put together, not the frail old woman they were used to seeing me as. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened it and saw Oswald and Prudence, both tense and wary. Oswald looked tired, with new wrinkles around his eyes. Prudence was as impeccable in appearance as ever, but I noticed a slight nervousness in the way she fiddled with the strap of her purse. "Come in," I invited them in. I made tea. We settled in the living room, and I poured the tea into cups, feeling strangely calm. The decision was made. There was no turning back. All that was left was to communicate it and move on. "So, Mom," Oswald began after an awkward pause, "you wanted to talk to us?" I put the cup on the table and looked at them directly. "Yes, Oswald, I've made some important decisions about my future, and I want to let you know." They exchanged quick glances, and I noticed Prudence tense up. "What decisions?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "First, I've decided to sell this house," I said calmly. "I've found a new place to live, a small house on Magnolia Street. I plan to move in within a month." "Sell the house?" Oswald looked shocked. "But Mother, this is our family home. Generations of Brambles have lived here. 3 generations to be exact," I corrected. "Not that many, and this house belongs to me, Oswald, not to the generations. I have the right to sell it if I want to." "But why?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Why change everything at your age?" "Just because I'm 74, not 34, I replied. "I don't have much time left, and I want to live it as I see fit, without the burden of the past, without painful memories." "What painful memories?" Prudence frowned. "I thought you loved this house." "I did," I agreed. "But in recent years, it had become a place of manipulation and deceit, a place where my own son tried to control me and dispose of my property without my consent. It had poisoned my memories of home." Oswald turned pale but remained silent. Prudence tried to change the subject. "And when do you plan to move?" "As soon as the papers for the new house are ready, in about 3 or 4 weeks." "And what about the things?" Oswald asked. "Furniture, paintings, my father's collection." "Some of it I'll take with me," I replied. "The rest will be donated to museums, galleries, or sold. Ebenezer is helping me with inventory and appraisals." "But some of these things are family heirlooms," Oswald exclaimed. "They must stay in the family." "And they will stay," I said. "But not all of them, and not now." He looked at me with a look of incomprehension. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. It was time to say the main thing. "I've changed the will and the structure of the trust, Oswald. You are no longer the primary beneficiary. You will receive a fixed sum, enough to live comfortably, but the majority of the estate will be given to the Bramble Foundation for charitable purposes." A heavy silence hung in the room. Oswald looked at me as if I had struck him. Prudence turned pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Are you disinheriting me?" Oswald said at last, and there was so much pain in his voice that for a moment I almost regretted my decision. "Almost." "No," I shook my head. "I am providing you with a fixed sum, which is more than enough for a good life. But I will not let you dispose of my entire fortune, given the way you tried to dispose of it while I was still alive." "It is unjust," he exclaimed, jumping to his feet. "I am your son, your only child." "Yes, you are my son," I agreed calmly. "But that does not entitle you to my property, Oswald, especially when you have shown that you do not respect my wishes and do not care about my feelings." Prudence finally broke her silence. "Myrtle, that sounds like an emotional decision made in a moment of resentment," she said with feigned concern. "Maybe you should think it over again. Give yourself some time to cool off." "I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks, Prudence," I said. "It's not an impulsive decision. It is the result of years of observing your behavior and realizing that you will never change." People change, Mother, Oswald said more quietly, returning to his chair. I can change. I can prove to you that you can trust me. Perhaps, I nodded. But I don't want to wait any longer for that change, Oswald. I don't want to spend my remaining years hoping that you will finally become a man I can respect. I want to live my life on my own terms. And you're just cut us out? There was disbelief in his voice. After all the years, everything we've been through together? I'm not cutting you out of my life, I said softer. I'm just setting boundaries. You can be a part of my life if you respect those boundaries. If you treat me as a person, not as a source of inheritance. If you value our relationship in and of itself, not for what you can get out of it. Prudence shook her head. That sounds like an ultimatum, Myrtle. No, I objected. It's just the truth. I will no longer pretend that everything is all right when it isn't. I will no longer remain silent when you try to control me. I will live honestly, with you and with myself. And what if we don't agree with your boundaries? Oswald asked with a challenge. What if we think you're making the wrong decisions? Then you are free to go your own way, I replied firmly. I'm not holding you back, but I will no longer let you tell me how to live my life. Oswald looked lost, as if the ground was falling away from under his feet. I understood his feelings. He had always regarded my fortune as his future security, a guarantee of the luxurious life to which he was accustomed. Now that assurance was gone, and he was going to have to rethink his life. We can challenge the changes in the will, Prudence said suddenly, and her legal training was on full display. If we can prove that you were under duress or not in your right mind. Don't threaten me, Prudence, I interrupted her calmly. Ebenezer had made sure everything was legally perfect. Besides, a challenge would take years, cost you a lot of money, and probably end in nothing. You're a good enough lawyer to realize that. She was silent, realizing the truth of my words. Then it's settled, Oswald said after a long pause. You have decided everything without us. Yes, I confirmed, because it's my life and my property, and I have the right to decide how to dispose of them. And now what? He asked quietly. What happens to us? What happens to our relationship? That's up to you, I said. I'm open to a relationship based on mutual respect, but I will no longer tolerate manipulation and control. Oswald and Prudence exchanged glances, and I saw in their eyes a mixture of anger, confusion, and perhaps a realization that the old rules no longer applied. We need time, Oswald said at last, to make sense of all this. Of course, I nodded. I understand. It's a big change for all of us. They left shortly afterward, quietly, almost suppressed. No dramatic scenes, no loud threats or accusations, just a quiet acceptance that the world as they knew it had changed forever. The next weeks flew by in a flurry of activity. The paperwork for the new house, organizing the move, sorting through things, all of it took time and energy. Ebenezer was by his side, helping with the legal aspects and providing moral support. I hadn't heard from Oswald and Prudence. I didn't call them, giving them time to digest the new reality. Part of me hoped that they would find the strength to change, to accept my terms, to become part of my new life, but as equals, with respect. The other part, the more realistic part, realized that was unlikely to happen. Too deeply ingrained were their habits. Too long had they seen me only as a source of future wealth. The house on Magnolia Street turned out to be exactly as I had hoped. Bright, cozy, with a lovely garden and a view of the park. It was much smaller than the old mansion, but that was the beauty of it. Less empty rooms, less echoes of the past, less space for ghosts and regrets. I took only the things dearest to my heart, Hubert's photographs, his favorite chair, a few paintings we'd chosen together, the collection of first editions he'd amassed over the years. The rest was sold, donated to museums, or given to the Bramble Foundation. The old house was bought by a young family with 2 children, an energetic couple who dreamed of a big house with history. Looking at their faces, full of excitement and plans for the future, I felt the house had fallen into good hands. They would breathe new life into it, create new memories, and fill it with laughter and love. On moving day, I walked through the rooms one last time, saying goodbye to each one. In the bedroom where Hubert died, I lingered the longest, letting the tears flow freely. It was goodbye not only to the house, but to an entire era of my life, my youth, my marriage, my illusions of marital happiness. I'm sorry for what happened, I whispered, as if Hubert could hear me. I tried, I really did, but sometimes you have to let go in order to move on. I didn't sleep much the first night in my new home, not because of sadness or regret, but because of a strange excitement, as if I were on the threshold of something new and exciting. In the pre-dawn twilight, I stepped out into the garden and breathed in the fresh air, filled with the scent of flowers and morning dew. A new day, a new life. A week later, I received a letter from Oswald, a real paper letter, not an email or a phone call. It was brief, written in his angular handwriting. Mom, I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation, about your words about boundaries and respect, about how Prudence and I have treated you over the years. I can't say I fully understand or accept your decision about the inheritance. It still seems unfair to me, but I'm beginning to understand why you made it. I need time to rethink a lot of things, to realize who I am without the expectation of a big inheritance, to learn to see you not just as a mother with money, but as a person with her own desires and rights. I don't know if I can change the way you want me to. I don't know if I can be a son you could be proud of, but I want to try. Give me time. Oswald. I reread that letter over and over again, searching between the lines for my son's true feelings. Was it a sincere admission of mistakes and a desire to change, or another tactic to regain my favor and perhaps a place in the will? I didn't know the answer, so I decided not to guess, but to just move on, day by day, enjoying the freedom and peace that my decisions brought. In my new home, I began new rituals. Every morning, a walk in the park, where I gradually got to know the other regulars, similarly elderly lovers of the morning air. Once a week, a book club meeting that met at the local library. Twice a month, volunteering at the animal shelter, where I helped with administrative work. I made new friends, people who appreciated me for who I was, not what I had. Ruth, an energetic widow in her 70s, who organized a book club and spoke with a soft Southern accent. Gerald, a former literature professor with whom we could discuss poetry and philosophy for hours. Eleanor, an artist who convinced me to try watercolor despite my protests that I never had a talent for drawing. Ebenezer visited me regularly, sometimes just for friendly conversation, sometimes on the business of the Bramble Foundation, which was expanding under my direction. We established the Hubert Scholarship for art history students, started a program to support local artists, and organized a series of exhibitions at the City Gallery. From Oswald came occasional letters and cards, discreet, polite, no mention of inheritance or estate. On Thanksgiving Day, he called and we talked for a few minutes, awkwardly, with long pauses, but without animosity or accusation. At Christmas, he and Prudence sent a gift, a beautiful handmade shawl that I knew couldn't be cheap. I sent them in return a book on gardening for Prudence. She had once mentioned that she would like to take up gardening, and antique cufflinks for Oswald, not too expensive, but tasteful. They were small steps, cautious attempts to rebuild the relationship on a new basis. I didn't know where they would lead or if they would lead to anything meaningful at all. But I was willing to give the process time, not expecting too much, but not closing the door completely either. In my new home, with my new friends and activities, I felt more alive than I had in years before. As if having shed the weight of pretense and manipulation, I could finally breathe fully, be myself, not a mother, not a widow, not the guardian of a family fortune, but simply Myrtle Bramble, a woman with her own life, her own desires, and a right to happiness. It was the beginning of a new chapter, perhaps the last in my life, but no less significant. A chapter I was writing on my own, without regard for the expectations of others, without fear of failing to live up to others' standards. In my journal, a new habit I've made since moving, I wrote, "It's never too late to start living for real. It's never too late to say no to what poisons you and yes to what empowers you. It's never too late to be brave." And it was true. At 74, I finally learned to be brave, not for others, but for myself. And in that bravery, I found a freedom I had never known before.